So today our purpose is I can use connections, this reminds me, to understand the main idea of the text. In other words, I can think about what does this book remind me of? And I can understand what the author was trying to tell us, what the most important part of the story is, based on what I understand. And we're talking about, when we're thinking about our thinking, I want you to think when I'm telling you what's inside of my head, it's kind of like when your mom asks, hey, what are you thinking? And if you don't stop and tell her what you're thinking, she won't know. So the same thing for you. When you're thinking about your thinking, you have to stop and ask yourself, what am I thinking? What does this book remind me of? Because unless you stop and ask yourself, it's kind of like your brain will forget to listen. So today while you're reading, I want you to stop and ask yourself, what are the words or the pictures reminding me of? What's happening in the book and what's my connection? And the book that we're going to read today is called The Relatives Came. And in this book, The Relatives Came, I wrote my thinking down on sticky notes, just like I always do. So 3 times during the book, I stopped and I thought, what does this book remind me of? The Relatives Came. So don't forget to think, what does it remind you of, too? It was, wrong direction. It was the summer of the year when the relatives came. They came all the way from Virginia. They left when their grapes were barely purple, not purple enough to pick. They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car. I love that detail. It smelled like a real car. And in it, they put an ice chest full of soda pop and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches. And up they came from Virginia. They left at 4 in the morning, when it was still dark, before even the birds were awake. What a great detail about the birds still being asleep. It was so early. They drove all day long and into the night, and they thought about Virginia. But most of all, they thought about us, just waiting for them. Okay, I had to stop there and think, what is this reminding me of? When I was a little girl, we used to get up really early in the morning, and we would drive all the way to Oregon. And we would fill our car up with snacks and blankets, and the whole entire time we kept saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And my mom would say, don't ask again. And the whole time I just could not wait to see my favorite cousins. So I know exactly how they felt. I know that they are dying to get there and see their relatives. And I know because it reminds me of my life. I wonder what it reminds you of. You might take a second and write down in your reading journal what you're thinking. So while they drove, they drank all their pop, they ate all their crackers or their Doritos, and traveled all those miles until they finally pulled up into our yard. Then it was hugging time. Talk about hugging! Those relatives just passed us around, pulling us against their wrinkled clothes, crying sometimes. They hugged us for what seemed like hours. I totally remember that. I'd have to hug my grandma, and I'd have to hug my grandpa, and I'd have to hug my aunt, and I'd have to hug my uncle. And the whole time I just wanted to go play. Then it was into the house, and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You had to go through at least 4 different hugs just to get to the front room. Those relatives. And then, finally, it was time to go to bed. The relatives weren't particular about beds, which was good because there weren't enough beds for all of us. So some squeezed in here or squeezed in there, and the rest slept on the floor. Some with their arms thrown over the person next to them and a leg across one person, an arm across another person. But wow, it felt different. All that different breathing inside our house. And I had to stop and just think about the whole book, because the whole thing, my brain is just saying, this is just like me. When I was a kid, I remember we would finally get to Oregon, and as soon as I could see my grandma's house, I'd be like, yes, yes, yes. And all I wanted to do was go jump on the trampoline with my cousins and go play on the four-wheelers and do all kinds of stuff. But first, I had to hug everybody. And then after we hugged everybody, we had to eat dinner with everybody. And finally, we could go play. And I remember one of my favorite things in the world was to just sleep with all my cousins, all of us together. We would sleep out on the trampoline, all sandwiched together, just like in this book. I know how much they love their family in this book, because it's just like me and my family. If you're making a connection to your family, take a second, write it down on a sticky note or in your journal. They stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us in the garden, and they fixed any broken things they could find. They need to come to my house and fix some broken things. They ate all our strawberries, our watermelons, and they promised we could eat their food when we came to Virginia. But none of us thought about that much. We just thought about being together. But then finally, after a long time, it was time for the relatives to go home. They left at 4 a.m. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them off in the dark. And the reason I know this is sad is because I felt sad when it was time to leave my family. And that connection reminds me and helps me understand how sad they are. We watched them disappear down the road while we waved and waved. And then we crawled back into our beds that felt too big and too quiet. And we fell asleep. And the relatives drove all day and all night. And while they drove, they thought about us. They missed us. And when they finally got home to Virginia, they crawled into their beds, which felt too soft and too silent, and they dreamed about seeing us next summer. That part is just like me. I know when it was time to say goodbye, lots of times I would run and hide, and my mom would have to come find me, and I would cry and cry the whole way home. And I knew I was happy that I'd got to see all my cousins, but I was so sad that it would be so long till I saw them again. And I remember getting home and just thinking, waiting for when I could see them again. I know they feel exactly the same way, that they can't wait for the next summer. Because just like me, the most important thing was their family. My connections, what this book reminded me of, helped me understand that this book is about how important our families are. Please take a few minutes, and you can rewind it and read it again if you want, or I could put a link to it and you can read it on YouTube. But take a minute and think, what did this book remind you of? Did it remind you of your favorite cousins? Maybe of some friends that you love that you don't get to see very much? Your grandma, your grandpa? Take a few minutes and think, what was this book about, and what did it remind you of? Reading is thinking. See you soon, Tigers.